Welcome, listener or viewer. I'm Ian Kennedy, the host and creator of the Nothing to Gain podcast, a series of recorded interviews with influential protagonists from around the music scene over the last few decades. There's no agenda other than to enlighten, inspire, and at times, hopefully, amuse you. If you like what you see and want to support, you can do so by donating to the GoFundMe campaign by clicking the link in the video description. Please share with your friends and feel free to comment and offer your thoughts. Two, one, and we're rolling, and that's Nick Clayton. Hi Nick, how are you?
I'm fine, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks. Thank you so much for doing this. This is the next installment of the Nothing to Gain podcast, and we're going to be talking to a journalist and Ibiza resident who I've known for many years here. There he is. And to start off with, Nick, I just looking into your history. You started working for the Sunday Times a long time ago, a Murdoch newspaper. Can you tell us about that, working in Fleet Street and that experience?
Well, I thought funny mixture of things. I graduated back in 1978. So my first job was actually in book publishing. I worked for Macmillan's, which also publishes magazines, and ended up as a journalist there. And freelance, I've been at uni in Edinburgh. I moved back to Edinburgh, trained to be a teacher. I was actually having worked briefly on Fleet Street. I didn't like it in a lot of ways, partly being in London, partly because I sort of fell into it. It was like the family business. Both my parents were journalists, both worked on Fleet Street. And although I was never able to use their contacts or anything, it still felt a bit like I was competing. So I moved back to Scotland. I taught for 4 or 5 years in the public sector. You know, although I went to a sort of post school, albeit with a scholarship, and I taught in fairly rough schools. And teaching was a job which I thought was absolutely vital, but vital for somebody else to do. Journalism, I sort of found my way back into it almost accidentally. The Sunday Times, there was a small ad, they were looking for sub-editors. I phoned up and they said, come in for what I thought was an interview, and found myself doing a shift away with newspapers. And then there I was working in Kinnan Park, which was where the Sunday Times was in Glasgow at the time, a place which I picketed as an NUJ activist at the time of the Wapping dispute, and which was all over by then. And I thought, from working as very much a lowly sub-editor, I sort of somehow wormed my way in.
Wow.
It's always happened by accident in journalism. Yeah.
In fact, I was going to refer to that because one of my favourite sort of journalist writers is Christopher Hitchens. And he describes, well, I think he quoted that Fleet Street was unredeemed squalor. But he ended up working in Fleet Street because he travelled down with some friends from Oxford with some books to sell, and ended up sort of selling some of these books. And then the following week he was employed, and that was it. I didn't realise that the Sunday Times was in Glasgow at the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the time it was in the first. It was before the Scottish Parliament. There was quite a lot of things happening in Scotland. The Sunday Times, all the newspapers had small offices there. Some of them actually, some of them actually quite big, and particularly the Daily Express, which back in the day was the biggest selling paper in the world. Certainly was the biggest selling daily newspaper in the UK, and they had a separate Scottish edition, and the others all had offices with a number of journalists, because the Scottish legal system being separate and so on. And there's a degree of sexiness about Scottish stories that they like to have. And then at the time when there was a huge expansion of newspapers, really after Wapping, the Scotsman launched the Sunday thing called Scotland on Sunday, and the Sunday Times launched a sort of Sunday supplement for Scotland, as well as having, separate stuff for that. Sport was the most obvious one. I mean, because in those days, you got most of your sports stuff from the newspapers. So, like my every Saturday was spent subbing, football reports from Scottish, from all over Scotland. So
those must have been fascinating. Scottish football's not that entertaining these days. I don't know about
that. No. I mean, even then, the last time a team outside the old firm won the Scottish League was Dundee United in 1983. So, right. I can barely remember that. So yeah. Although it was more interesting then than it is now. It wasn't quite so dire.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, as I say, so it was very much on the sort of a back of an envelope when they launched the Sunday Times Scotland. Literally, Andrew Neil flew up the week before Scotland on Sunday was going to launch and said, "This is what we're going to do."
Yeah.
And they just pulled people in. And it was great. I mean, there was in fact, the owner of Rangers launched a tabloid newspaper called the Sunday Scot. So, I mean, those Sundays huge. I mean, basically, anybody that could string two words together could get a job on a Scottish newspaper. So I got in and then spent the rest of my life hoping not to be found out, that I've never had any. My journalism training lasted for 2 weeks. So,
you've done pretty well after 2 weeks training, I'd say.
Yeah, well, yeah. It is, and particularly on daily newspapers, on local newspapers, there's much more emphasis on trade and training. So people have been, through the formal training. Whereas you find an awful lot of people on national newspapers. I'm not quite sure how, but hoping not to be found out. They don't actually know what the hell they're doing.
So yeah, I mean, the Sunday Times, for those that don't know, it was a Murdoch paper, and obviously his history since I've also done a bit of research that Murdoch bought the paper 1 month after I was born, in 1981, and since then, I mean, we're looking at 40 years of Murdoch publicity, and I think he's the definition of what you call a media mogul these days. What's your opinion of like modern journalistic practice at TV? And I've got other questions about journalism, about freedom of speech and certain issues like that. But let's just start with that concept now of like mainstream global sensationalist journalism that Murdoch was very much part of.
Well, I mean, although it's part of it, it's very much, the economics of it has changed so much. I mean, there's other definite phases. When I first started working in journalism in the 70s, it was all hot metal and very much controlled by the unions. So very expensive to produce newspapers. And then post-Wapping, you got the initial computerization, which eliminated most of the skilled print workers. So it became much, much cheaper. So suddenly that's how you end up with all these colour supplements. And the Sunday Times became the size of, a small encyclopedia every week and all that sort of. So you had this brief period when it was enormously profitable. And then the internet came along and suddenly that knocked the economics out of the newspaper industry, because particularly on so-called quality newspapers, probably about 50 to 60% of the income is not from the cover price, but from advertising. And the internet just took that away, particularly the two biggest earners for newspapers, which were jobs and property. And suddenly, basically, I mean, when you're looking to recruit somebody, you're recruiting from a fairly small pool. But it's much easier to do it if you just email them and cheaper, basically, than having to pay for advertising when 99% of people who buy it, look at the product, have no interest in it. So the same with property. You're paying to advertise property to people who are never going to buy that, but they're advertising the same supplement that has one-bedroom flats and castles. And so either way, you're paying for those people who aren't interested in either. So much better than you would have an email database. And so the newspapers lost all their profitability. As a result of that, there's been this sort of race to the bottom. So the number of journalists producing number of pages have been so far reduced, they just don't have the time to do things properly anymore.
Do you have any? I mean, yeah, it's a really sort of good point. I hadn't particularly. Well, I knew that essentially because of the lack of revenue from printing newspapers. Obviously, the medium had to change in certain ways, and obviously the amount of journalists and the style of journalism would change. What about I'd like to ask you about this idea of truth in journalism now. Obviously journalism is a subjective medium, but there was always been in the past, I believe, the sort of the standard of checking sources. I think that's what journalism 101 is about. And that, in terms of internet journalism now, has become a very muddied area, in such that finding out what the truth is much more subjective than in terms of a search than it would have been in the past. It depends where you read and what they say the truth is. What are your opinions on this new age of truth?
Well, I mean, my most successful period in journalism specialises in tech. I mean, at the start of the internet, I was really excited by the whole prospect at the beginning because, I mean, it seems incredible now, but at the beginning of the internet, it was completely non-commercial, and anything that was commercial that was discussed was absolute. I mean, what they called the flame wars, which meant that if you advertise, you'll find yourself piled on by all these people who shouldn't be advertising on the internet. I mean, this was in the days when graphics and stuff like that. So there was debate. I found it very exciting because the thought that people could actually get the information themselves rather than it being mediated by people like me who, although I completely disagree with a lot of stuff that Murdoch says, nonetheless, you censor yourself as you write, you want to keep your job. You know there's a certain, you're writing for a particular editor. But we didn't foresee the sort of the massive growth of fake news. I mean, I really, which has horrified me. But there's still a difference between what disparaging is called mainstream media or whatever, and the people who write blogs and all the rest of it, in that there is that. Truth is always a hard thing, but there's certainly a belief in facts, in having reliable sources, and able to say this is where the information comes from. Obviously, there's selectivity about that. There's always a sensationalism about it because it's sort of built in. News is what is different. So the more different it is, the more newsworthy it is to a degree. So there's always been a sensationalism to it, but it's become worse because you're chasing clicks now, which wasn't the case before. And the sort of morality that was, a lot of it has disappeared. And I don't know what a solution is. I don't think that Murdoch's as much a victim of that as anybody else.
Yeah, I guess you're right on that. I think everyone's the loser in this scenario, isn't it? It's the ability to publish yourself, which obviously Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and services like that have given anybody, even sort of bots and not real people, the opportunity to publish and publish their own views. And there's a strict code of freedom of speech, which seems to be really ineffective at the moment. I mean, just looking at the amount of racist abuse that's being dished out on social media towards footballers at the moment, it's quite clear that the standards, or maybe the ethics, are there in writing, but in practice, the mass publishing that's going on has just completely dissolved any sense of standard, I think, in terms of morality and content. There's another issue I was going to talk to you about, is if you'd heard about a sort of a tragic story, really, a film called The Internet's Own Boy, a guy called Aaron Schwartz, who invented Reddit. And Reddit was designed as a notice board for people to talk freely and to share information freely. But he kind of became a bit of a figurehead for this idea of free information, like scientific journals being available for free rather than people having to go through a paywall. And because he was at MIT, he planned, because he was hugely famous already at the time. He was a kind of a pioneer of the new internet age. He plugged his laptop into a server room downstairs and was downloading terabytes of documents and then making them available. That was his only crime. But the federal police in America turned him into a pariah for this, and I think almost went on record of saying, we're going to make an example of you. And I won't ruin the film to anyone who hasn't seen it in terms of the ending, but do you think that's now set a very dangerous precedent? As you say, there's a lot of fake news, and the news that is scientifically accurate, as in it's been through university processing and peer review, that then it becomes something that isn't free access to people. So therefore, how do we trust what is free access? And is the stuff that isn't free access worth the money?
I mean, yes, I remember the story. I've looked at it recently. I mean, and that sort of, I mean, it does reveal, I mean, as I say, the dream was that I thought it'd be great, people can actually access the original information. If you become interested in something, you can actually check it yourself. So that, whereas when you're extracting information, obviously there's a degree of subjectivity to that, the way you see things, and also the way you correlate stuff is always going to be different. And someone who's doing things like that is saying that, particularly academic stuff, should all be free. Although it is also an enormously profitable industry, as publishing academic text. But that, I mean, again, what happened to him was a tragedy. I mean, but I mean, what you can trust and what you can't trust, it really is just a matter of going to source and trying to figure it out. It's something which particularly annoys me about the stuff that gets posted on Facebook, that people post it without posting any sort of source. They'll say, yeah, whatever it happens to be, the percentage of people that are dying from COVID or from flu or whatever, which there's always a variety of statistics. You want to know where that data actually comes from. Yeah. And also, I mean, there's a variety of ways. We're none of us experts on everything. It's impossible to be. But you can look and see what the sources are and see how much of how many people that actually represent. But also you can look at other people who do know what they're talking about and what their criticisms of that sort of thing, what I call peer review. So the academic stuff is there, but people don't bother to look at it, basically because people can't be asked to look and check stuff, particularly if it fits what they believe already. They're not going to check and see why, simply whether that's accurate or not. Why challenge what's telling you what you know already? It's as I say, I'm always interested in stuff which contradicts my worldview.
Yeah, it's like on your point of why why look at something that you know already, or people can't be asked to find out the real source? I think there's an absolute truth in that. They can't be bothered. I think you could also say, which might be cruel in some stages, in some cases, sorry, that were they to look into the academic paper or the peer review, that it might actually be a little bit above their heads, sort of intellectually, to understand the subtleties of the issue. And I think personally, I think what's happened is leading back to Murdoch and sensationalist news. It's almost proliferated into people's social network behavior, that becoming sensationalist and having a headline to talk about, a bit more tabloid, if you like, is something that's been inherited from previous generations of just being hammered by tabloid press. And now people have the opportunity to do it themselves without much comeback, because they don't, people don't have to, for example, newspapers, national publishers, there are certain standards and certain things that they have to adhere to, they can be done for libel and they can be done for slander. Whereas a personal publishing platform like Facebook, they don't have to adhere to those same regulations. So essentially it's free game and whatever they can say. I'm finding it in some conversations, and I don't want to necessarily go down that rabbit hole, very frustrating to ask people, well, where did that come from? What can you base that very, very strong and very this point you're making with a lot of conviction, what can you base that on? Do you find yourself as a journalist specifically, do you find that happening in modern life?
Oh, completely. I mean, to be honest, it's why I've stayed away from Facebook for the last few months, is because there is so much of that stuff that people state boldly. And if you ask them where it comes from, they'll refer me to some YouTube video, which takes me no further. You spend half an hour watching some bloke somewhere rabbiting on about his theories of that, this, that, and the other. But it doesn't actually take me any further to see where he gets his information from. I find it intensely frustrating. But it's one of the things that sort of standard things of journalism. You might not name your sources, but you have to actually have your sources. And you have to have not just one, but two sources to corroborate it. People don't seem to realise the subtleties of that quite often. Because you hate most of the journalists is being caught out for being factually wrong. And people, you lose sleep over it. You do make mistakes and misunderstand people, but it happens very rarely. I can remember the times that I've done it. I've been absolutely mortified.
I'd say so. I'd say for a journalist, it's like the worst thing that can happen, because it will completely discredit your professionalism.
Yeah, people don't think that exists, but it does. Yeah, and people are doing stuff on Facebook. They don't really care. If you pull them up on something factually, they'll say, "Well, it should be true," or "Yeah, I feel it's true," or something like that. But what? Yeah, but it still doesn't mean that there's any basis of evidence.
Yeah. Look, we could talk a long time about this. It's really nice hearing your thoughts on it. And as I say, from someone who's worked in the journalistic profession for so long, I think they're very relevant views. But in terms of moving things onwards a little bit, you've been in Ibiza now for how long have you been here now?
17 years next week.
17 years. It'll be 13 years almost next week, 2 weeks time for me. And one thing that you wrote, you're well known for writing, is a guide to living abroad. I can't remember, what was the publishing house for that? But
The Guardian.
The Guardian published it, right? So, I'm supposing this was quite a successful project for you, because I don't know, but it's certainly out there. It's quite easy to find. And I guess there's two questions, which you can sort of choose whichever order you'd like to answer them in. One is, what was the motivation behind writing it, and how did it then end up becoming what experience was it to write and publish? The other is, if you were to be writing the guide to living abroad this year, what would you change?
The way it came about was I wrote a column for The Guardian called A Desk in the Sun, a monthly column, which was fairly loosely based about just working abroad. And it came about, as always with these, just through personal contact. When I was at the Scotsman, I was the technology editor, and one of the I got proteges getting his first job in journalism. I was working for the supplement that I edited, a guy called Neil McIntosh. And he was by then he was a Guardian, what's his official title, deputy editor of some sort, or assistant editor. And so he took me on to do a column. And then actually went on to the Wall Street Journal and I ended up working for them, another Murdoch newspaper, but that's another story. So I was writing that. And at the same time, I was pitching for a book. Nothing like that. It was one which was actually very similar to, I didn't realise at the time, a book called The White Island that was being written at the same time. So by the time my agent was hawking it round, that one had been in actual publishing, so I didn't get it. And then The Guardian approached me and said, would I write it? And it was a nightmare, to be honest. Writing books is an enormous amount of work for most people, for almost no reward. I mean, I would have been much, much better spending my time flipping burgers at McDonald's. I mean,
Wow.
It really pays pennies. I mean,
Right.
I mean, really, if I write for technology publications, I wrote quite regularly for the BBC. I could make as much writing 2 days for the BBC as I made for that book entirely.
Right.
So, and it's just an enormous amount of work. Now, in terms of how much I'd changed, the timing was very bad anyway, because it came out just as the 2007, 2008 crash happened. So there was less opportunity to work abroad. But now, in some ways, it's all coming full circle. Because part of the reason I was chosen to do it was I was one of the people that's not quite a digital nomad, but certainly somebody who, if you can work from home, why does home have to be, in a wet suburb? It can be by the beach and can work from anywhere. So to that extent, I mean, now it's about come of age. Working from home has, because of the pandemic, has been normalised. So, and I think some of them might come on to it later with Ibiza, but it's something I would hope and expect to see developing more in Ibiza, is people working that remotely, that sort of way.
Yeah, I think so. I think even in my time here, I've worked from home quite a bit. But advice I've given to people along the road is that if your income can come from somewhere else rather than Ibiza, then you're in a fairly unique and very privileged position, because if it means that you can still earn your money but live here, because obviously the seasonal lifestyle here makes it quite difficult for a lot of people, certainly this year, to kind of get into some kind of secure financial state. And I'd be very interested to see how many people start moving out here next year. I think it's certainly been a lovely place to be in during this lockdown. Yeah.
I mean, certainly from my point of view, when I moved here 17 years ago, it was very, very different. Working abroad. and it wasn't so accepted. I mean, I set things up. So I still had when people phoned me, they phoned an 0131, an Edinburgh number. And so they didn't know I was here. There was no social media. I mean, Facebook hadn't launched then. There were no smartphones. Camera phones were very, very rare. So you could have a sort of double existence. I mean, there was also always the benefit that you could have the hour's time difference. So I could stand down to my computer, pick up the phone, and it would, at 11:30 on a Monday morning, and interview somebody, and they wouldn't know that I was sitting there, but in my dressing gown at best. I had been spaced the day before, and you could have that sort of do it, and they wouldn't know. I mean, whereas you could see that the sort of change gradually over that time. I mean, some things improved massively. I mean, I couldn't have done a video call 17 years ago. If I was doing phone calls over the internet, you had to make sure that no one else was using the internet. All the other computers were switched off. You had to keep the fingers crossed. When I was out in the camper, I had satellite internet. So if it rained, I couldn't have a conversation. Before that, if it rained, the rain would affect the phone line so much that it would go down. So those sorts of things improved enormously. But at the same time, you can't have your Facebook existence is there for the world to see. So when they know you've been at space. On the other hand, you get a sort of envy now. I mean, my favourite story like that was one of the jobs I used to do for the Wall Street Journal was on luxury property. I used to do luxury house of the day, which would be some multi-million euro, pound, whatever, property somewhere in Europe. And I was interviewing a guy who was selling, it was actually a farm in Hampshire for, I don't know, so 7 or 8 million. And he was selling it because he was spending all his time at his townhouse in, where it was in central London. And then he assumed I was in New York, and towards the end of the interview, he said to me, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm in Ibiza." There was a pause, and he said, "You bastard." So at this point, right, here I am, multi-millionaire, feels envious of me. This is what I want. So I think that's going to come back. That will happen more. Now the infrastructure exists, and whether it be co-working spaces or what, I don't know. But certainly I can see people coming and working for, at least part of the time. Because, as you know, working from home ain't easy. I mean, it can feel very isolating, and it means that work time never ends, which requires sort of powers of organisation I don't have. There's a deadline, I'll meet it, but just.
Yeah, I know exactly that feeling. Yeah, that work never ends. I mean, now we've got a studio here as well, so it makes a lot of sense for us to run our business from home. But it's a tough one. That sort of self-discipline and being distracted. Sometimes I like to think that my workflow, it works better when I'm just free flow rather than if I have to focus on one particular thing and get it finished. And then you flirt between other things, and then something else comes in, and Nell will come home, and there'll be a phone call or an email that we need to respond to, and it will just take me off. Yeah, you just end up with lots of unfinished projects, I guess.
Yeah, yes, I'm certainly vouch for that. I mean, I spent a lifetime working to deadlines, and I really miss them. I mean, the theory that I can now write pretty much about what I want. So hard just full of unfinished projects, but started off great, and I just sort of lost interest in after a few days, particularly over the last few months, which um, I felt should have been massively creative and haven't been.
I found it really difficult because I've started a few writing projects. One of the things I found difficult about the last few months is the piecemeal addition of more restriction, or another 2 weeks and another 2 weeks. And what I found is that if someone had just said, right, you've got 2 months, and that we're not going to, it's going to be locked down now for 2 months. We're not going to start sort of feeding you these dates before that, and then that's your lot. I would then have probably used the time better. But when you've got this every 2 weeks, you've got this, or every month, there's a kind of a little carrot on a stick saying things will be going back to normal. You start trying to kind of I start putting my kind of long-term creative projects to one side and start planning for getting back on the, getting back out there and actually doing gigs. But then that will be delayed, and then it'll be delayed again. And that's happened so many times. I think it's eroded or certainly it's eroded my kind of enthusiasm. I'm just in this kind of state of limbo now, where when it happens, it will happen. And that, I'm not particularly being very productive in the meanwhile, although I'm doing the podcast, which can't be a bad thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do you know what? We'll move on to another subject, right? It's really interesting stuff we talked about. And this is on a slightly different tone to it. And it's come from two different angles. One was I was doing my research about where you went to school. Obviously, you were in Edinburgh and place, but you went to Latimer school, right? Now, I went to Dulwich College. And, yeah, so my folks, or my mum just got in touch, said, "Oh, your school's been in the news recently." There's a website which is obviously, again, it's a product of the new sort of new forms of publishing. A website that's allowing people to post up accounts of essentially, I think it started with sexual abuse and sexual harassment, but there's a much broader sort of range of topics that are covered now. And I looked at the site, and it came up that some of the first issues were posted about Latimer, and then there's quite a few about Dulwich as well. So what was you went to school, obviously. I went in the 90s, which is, a very different era. But I mean, what was your experience of public school like? And are you, in a sense, I'm quite glad that these things are coming out into the open. I think they've been sort of covered up for too long. What do you think?
I mean, it's changed so much. I mean, the most obvious way was when I was there, it was an all-boys school. So, I mean, and so, I mean, a lot of that, what seemed to be reported there, couldn't happen. I mean, because, I mean, it was not a boarding school, so there wasn't that sort of boarding school thing. Yeah. So, I mean, I wasn't too unhappy about it, because I hated school. So, and I mean, I was there at that time. It was a direct grant school, and so it's sort of halfway between private and public, or private and state. So I had a scholarship. My parents didn't pay to send me there. It was also in the days of the 11 plus, and so I passed my 11 plus, and in some ways it was the most convenient school. So, so as I say, I mean, really, I was so surprised. I mean, I haven't been there since I left. So I mean, that's say 1973. So the last time I was there was 13th of July, 1973. I remember finishing on Friday the 13th. Seemed so appropriate. But I left. 3 months later, I went off to India for 7 months, came back to London for a couple of months, then went to the States for the summer, then went to Edinburgh. So I really had no contact with it since then. And funnily enough, I mean, one or two people I was at school with, I've got sort of contact with through Facebook. But yeah, I mean, I haven't seen anybody else at school with since. I saw one in 2000, and before that, it'd probably be about 76, 77, something like that. So,
long time ago.
yeah, so really, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was just interested because it's, you know, I witnessed certain things at my school, which I remember telling my parents about at the time. And I don't know if they ever properly took me seriously until I repeated them in my early 20s or mid after university. And they were pretty shocked. And I was like, no, I did see stuff like that go on, you know. And I think in this day and age, I mean, certainly with people like Boris Johnson running the country, I think it's important that that what really happens in these elitist schools becomes a bit more public knowledge rather than just folklore. You know, that I think the actual accounts can be quite shocking, really.
I mean, there was certainly, and there were a lot. I mean, there were a number of the teachers who were definitely paedophile. One of them got done, and but it was much more. I mean, it wasn't a big deal in those days. It seems strange, but yeah, I mean, it wasn't. Yeah, there were lots of. I mean, yeah, and the same thing with all that. When growing up in London, I mean, the people I knew who knew, you know, there were girls who were at my sort of sister's school who I had sex with rock stars and stuff like that. They were guys as lucky didn't know us back in 13 or 14. It was not a big deal. I mean, after all, there was Bill Wyman there with his 12-year-old girlfriend. And I mean, I remember Gary Glitter's 12-year-old girlfriend being 14 or whatever she was, doing the stuff that news of the world. And the main thing was that she revealed that he was bald. And then he says, well, I mean, no concern about the sexual thing. So it really was, it was a different world then, you know, so.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I mean, it's certainly a world that was a lot easier to be allowed to get away with stuff like that, really. I think it's, you know, it's at least a good sign of the times that that child protection has become something that's taken a lot more seriously. Whereas I know that my school would have used the cane and various other punishments for as long as they possibly could have, really, until it was deemed illegal.
Yeah, I agree. Certain corporal punishment was the norm when I was at school.
Yeah, I've heard. I mean, just on a kind of lighter note, I've heard a story recently that there are children in secondary school. They're kind of, I guess, they're protesting against certain black children and Asians have been asked to that their hair is inappropriate. You know, I don't know exactly what type of haircuts we're talking about, but that someone was sent home from school for having their afro too big, that sort of thing, which I think is a funny story. But we've come to the point now where that is considered a racist issue, and it just made me start to think of like the haircuts that you're allowed to have in North Korea, and that kind of that kind of concept of like it looks like a Greek barber shop in the East End, but actually no, these are the regulation haircuts for North Koreans at the moment. Are we heading in that direction? I don't know.
When I was at school, it was long hair that we got in trouble for. So.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I mean, but I think I said to the person who told me about this story, I said, okay, well, look, rather than getting all outraged, you know, if you turned up to school with your hair down to your hips or something, you'd also be sent home. But I think this was because his afro was so big that the kid behind couldn't see the ball.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I went on from long hair, so I had a skinhead haircut instead. So yeah, number one crop with a razor parting. So I was in trouble for that as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's very easy to get in trouble in those schools, actually. So let's move forwards a little bit in time, or quite a lot in time, and talk about Ibiza. And you wrote for, I remember, a magazine which I don't think maybe it's published still, but Pasha magazine. was a very, I would say, very, very nicely published collection of, like you say, adverts, but editorial and articles and features. And you first became, I was first aware of you because of you were publishing some articles in Pasha magazine. And I think now it's almost a bit of a collector's item for some Ibiza residents. I've seen a lot of people's houses where they've got all of the editions kind of, and I think that's a sign of a really good publication. What were your sort of, do you remember any of the articles you wrote for Pasha?
The one I remember most was about the rabbi. I don't know if you ever saw that one, but it was just such a bizarre story. There was this guy who, he lived I don't know, on the sort of San Juan Road in various places, but he was a rabbi, and he came over to Ibiza because he felt as if God had directed him here. So he arrived in Ibiza with no money and a wife who was 8 months pregnant. And about 6 or 7 days before he left. But he just had this belief that God would provide for everything. Kraus, I'm just trying to remember his name now. I saw that contact from him occasionally. But he used to do things, he would go to Pasha and stuff like that, and would dance at Pasha. And of course he would get restless because he would turn the rabbi away from Pasha. I mean, he was actually sort of disowned by some people. He is in Israel now. But it was just a wish for money. I mean, after I'd written the piece, a friend of mine contacted me who just owned a big house in Villa. And the rabbi had actually, the old house that was there, had actually rented it off him and was going to buy it to pay the mandatory deposit. And just hoped that the money would appear in order to pay for this enormous house in that villa, which he was convinced had a Jewish connection. And there is what was called the street of the Jews, which is up to the top of that villa, and is sealed off and has been since the 17th century. So there is a sort of Jewish connection. I mean, there's a Jewish connection with Ibiza. But he made a lot more of it. He was a member of this Hasidic sect and was basically disowned by them. But I just remember him because it was a great story. I mean, the others tended to be more sort of straightforward. Mark and Ramon, but I got him to do because for some reason when Leo opened, he played there. I mean, why the only surviving member of the Ramones who played Leo, who knows? But I mean, and other stuff was more sort of straightforwardly Ibiza music scene. Interviews with Tiesto and people like that. But no, I mean, Ben Turner, it was actually through the Guardian column that Ben Turner, the editor, approached me and so I did stuff occasionally. I mean, not a huge amount of them, always with Ibiza, that paid better than most. But with Ibiza publications is that they pay so badly that most people will do them simply in order to get on guest list or whatever. They're here for a few weeks. They're not actually bothered about making a living. They want a holiday. And if they can say, oh, I'm a journalist with whatever, so much the better. I mean, I can't compete with that, not in terms of money. So.
I love that story about the rabbi.
But I came across him, that was brilliant.
If you've ever got, if you can ever send me a photo or a little clipping of it,
I'm sure I've got a PDF of it somewhere.
Yeah, that's the thing about Ibiza is it does have. I still think it will continue to have. It has some personal stories that are in themselves little mini novellas. You know, they're such a diverse place, and people come from so many different backgrounds, and there's a lot made of you know, what we've all got in common. And I think basically, you know, people who like Mediterranean lifestyle with a bit of edge to it, and that's persevered through decades, really, that attitude. And go on, sorry.
As I said, I mean, there's always been a sort of appreciation of art in the sort of widest sense, you know, whether it's a performance in musician or producing music or painting or photography or whatever it happened to be. It goes right the way through. I mean, I can't imagine being anywhere else as I've been here, waiting for the football to start and discussing the wildflowers, and things like that, but it was definitely blokes, it was, and that sort of thing makes Ibiza different. In fact, one was a transvestite as well, which made it was very much, just made Ibiza so different. I don't think it's as different as it was, but anyway, that's another subject.
Yeah, maybe it's not. Yeah, I think there's maybe a bit more. It's kind of become a little bit more conventional in certain senses, like in the type of personality that we're talking about, like an artist, creative. It's finding it harder to survive here long term, and then harder to justify just coming back and forth, because that's not what people came here for in the first place. A lot of people come here to stay. So yeah, I think that's a very good point I missed about appreciation for creativity, as you saw it, call it, and art, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting. Oh, is that? Oh, what? We've got Nell back. Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting sort of 13 years getting to know people, and in that way. And you mentioned Ben Turner before about Pashamak, and possibly one of the cultural shifts that's been happening in Ibiza the last 10 years. Ben's responsible for this international music summit, where the music industry of the world now drop into Ibiza once a year, obviously pandemic aside. And then you see what people, I've been to Miami and I've not been to the Amsterdam dance event, but you see what the international music scene sort of behaves like when they're all in one place at one time. So Ben's he's one of the founding fathers of the IMS. Have you seen, since the IMS begun, and in terms of dance music, the shortening of opening hours for clubs, I think there's a lot less variety on the dance floors now, and prices going up. What's your opinion of how this over commercialization of music and the scene has demonstrated itself in Ibiza? And how do you think it's going to change, given that the music scene has taken a massive hit in the last 12 months?
I mean, one thing to say with the International Music Summit, I mean, actually, that in some ways there's a straight line between that and Passion Managing, in the sense that there's Ben and then the other people who started IMS, Mark and Danny, we're all directors of Pasha. We're all working on Pasha as part of Pasha Man, and then went off to do the IMS. So, I mean, it's the same team, basically, Pasha Man and the IMS. I think to a certain extent, who knows what's going to happen after this summer. I can't see this summer really happening in any meaningful way. I can't see dance floors opening up. It just, because of all, I mean, it just, as you say, keeps getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and at some point they will decide they want to cut their, they want to risk the losses, and people won't come to pay extra to stand in an empty dance floor. And that's always been the problem. You have to have the crowds before the crowds will come, and that's going to be, I don't know how it can start this summer. Whether it'll start next summer, I don't know, because in some ways Ibiza is sort of an anachronism, in the sense that all the super clubs in the UK have gone, most of them have gone in Germany. There are not many places which, which can support that. It's not, people aren't sort of going from cream in Liverpool to cream here or whatever. I don't know, after a 2-year gap, whether people will want to go back to that. I don't know. And whether that means that there'll be more places like Leo and Hart rather than, DC10. I don't know. I mean, that's a possibility. I mean, it's all. I mean, and the other nature of things that's changing completely is, in recent years, Ibiza has been very successful in adapting itself to short break holidays, which across Europe has been a huge change. People now spend more time on short breaks than they do on the sort of 2-week bucket and spade holidays, as they call them. And Ibiza has been fortunate in it's been able to make that transition. Well, if you have to pay €200 to be tested there and back, it makes what seemed like an economical weekend impossible. So what happens to short breaks? We don't know that either. So at the moment, so much is up in the air. I can't see how we can forecast what will develop.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in terms of trying to work out or get some kind of gauge on it, one thing that I can guarantee is that the people who invested last year in those kind of promotions and the billing and even the running of these venues, they've obviously taken a massive hit, although they were making millions and millions in profit every year for the last 20 years. So they're more likely as businesses to be able to suffer a year of without the doors open.
Oh, yeah.
They'll also be very keen to get open as soon as possible in whatever form that might be. And a friend of mine put a theory forward that it's just going to all be VIP and seating now, and there's going to be no dance floor, which I disagree with wholeheartedly, because I don't think a venue such as Amnesia, for example, could ever exist in its true form if it doesn't have a dance floor. And I think that they'll be open as soon as they can, and they'll be selling tickets, and they'll be charging €20 for a beer, and as soon as they possibly can.
I mean, the question is whether they let the customers. I mean, another way of looking at your friend's suggestion, but it might be that there's more move to live music now, because live music, where you've got to focus on the stage, it's easier to do social distancing. I mean, when they had that gig in Barcelona, 5,000 people at it, it was a live gig, everybody masked. You can't be masked on the dance floor, because people are drinking them. It just doesn't work. Whereas to go and see a band for an hour and a half with a mask on, not the most enjoyable way of doing things, but it is possible. I mean, if somebody said, well, you can go and see a band tomorrow, you have to wear a mask, I would do it. I would do it pretty much no matter what band it was. But whereas you can go on the dance floor, but you've got to be socially distanced and wear a mask. I'm not sure I'd be so keen.
No, I mean, I wouldn't want to go in. I wouldn't want to go in. Maybe it's naive of me, but I just sort of, I hope, I pray that just the social distancing and masks will become a thing of the past in the not too distant future, rather than a permanent fixture in everyone's lives. What do you think about that?
I mean, after all, in the Far East, masks have become so acceptable. I mean, not 100%, but during flu season and so on, people wear masks and it does resist transmission. And quite possibly there'll be, certainly you'll see a situation where it won't look odd to wear a mask in enclosed areas because when infectious diseases come around. I mean, the reason why in the Far East it's become, so accepted. It's because after all they had SARS and MERS, which almost developed into pandemics, a couple of decades before, decade before the COVID pandemic. So they've been through it. I mean, it just depends how quickly people forget about it, because it looks likely that this is not the last of the pandemic. I mean, because if it is spreading from bats and things like that into human population, we are encroaching so much on that sort of land. There's going to be more opportunities to do it. And when you've had, SARS, MERS, and Ebola, all of which could have developed further, there's going to be other ones that come along. So I don't think it'll become absolutely, you have to wait all the time. I can see when you're going on the tube in London, at least half the people wearing masks and no one's going to look at it oddly. It just become the new normal, if you like.
Yeah, the dystopian future.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think it's that big a deal, but yeah.
Yeah, I think, no, I don't think it's a massive deal to do it. It's the knock-on cultural effect it's had, I think. I mean, obviously it's a very divisive subject, with a lot of people really disagreeing and other people recognizing a preventative healthcare measure, which is important. And that seems to be the case with a lot of issues these days, that they seem to divide the audience in a very polarized way. Do you think there's any role for, you published with The Guardian, they seem to be publishing a lot of articles at the moment that create that polarized opinion. Do you think there's a responsibility from the journalistic world to accept that, some people have got very strong views to the contrary, and that what we call the kind of the alternative leftist view, it needs to be tempered a little?
Depends how you, I see it more coming from the right, that sort of divisive, and which is, partly reflects the problem. And it's one of those situations where the media has a responsibility, but on the other hand, it is also reflecting something which is goes beyond. The media is just part of it. I mean, it's not something which it's separate from. It's not something which it can change just in itself. And I mean, it has to be. I mean, we have to look more at freedom of speech and so on, which is always has been highly complex and not. I just don't know the answer on that.
Okay, well, I'll give you a different question. I'm sure you're going to have some answers for this. You've got to pick 3 bands to perform in Ibiza once live music venues are allowed to open. They could be dead or alive as well. Let's make it interesting. Who would you choose?
Yeah. I mean, it's the best live band I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of times is The Who.
The Who, yeah.
I mean, back in their heyday, obviously, when
it wasn't at the Valley Stadium in Charlton by any chance.
I was there, yeah.
You were there?
Yeah, Bad Company and The Who, and
that's where my house is, just above the Valley Stadium.
Right.
That's where I grew up. Yeah. So I think it was logged as the loudest ever live concert.
Yep, I was there.
Wow.
In fact, the last train, I had to walk all the way back from there to Richmond. So
you walked from Charlton to Richmond?
Yeah.
Wait, I think for anyone who doesn't know the geography of London, walking from Charlton to Richmond, I would imagine it's probably about 3 or 4 hours walk.
I would think so, yeah. It was a long time anyway.
What, in the middle of the night as well?
Yeah. I mean, there weren't enough trains at the end of the gig.
I'm so glad I asked this question.
I mean, the first time I saw them was even better because they were they were playing at the Albert Hall, and it was the same day as the Stones played in Hyde Park. So basically, I stayed on, and then we knew ways of getting into the Albert Hall for nothing. And so we went from the Stones to watch The Who, supported by Chuck Berry, at the Albert Hall. And The Who blew the Stones away. I mean, they were just, they were just superb. So
The Who's number one.
The Who, something I'm going to sort of, now I'm going to flip back to sort of rock stuff.
Well, I think it'd be good to have a nice shake-up on the island, you know, a proper live band, you know.
I mean, if we're going back to my youth, I suppose Hendrix as well. I mean, just because he was always my hero from, and just, I sort of theoretically saw him live at the Isle of Wight, but not really, because I was semi-conscious when he was on. I mean, I was only 14, another story. But yeah, partly just because I had the opportunity to do that. But my mind is just, why now it's old age. I'm officially a pensioner as from Friday.
Happy birthday for Friday.
Yeah, so I 66, which is when you now get your UK pension. So my brain hasn't said who I would go for. Yeah.
Oh, it's a really tough one, isn't it?
Yes, it's about, I suppose, Chemical Brothers or something like that have to be.
Nice, yeah.
Because I've never seen them in Ibiza. I've seen them Bob was explaining, I should say the Clash as well. But yeah, probably be there. Was it 5 we were up to?
Yeah. No, it doesn't have to. Three's enough.
Yeah.
3's enough. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, those ones were definitely a bit, and it's just with my mind's a blank on sort of recent stuff.
Don't worry, I know I've fired quite a few topics at you, but I think it's coming up now. Yeah, we're coming up to about an hour and a half. I'm going to have to wind this up now, Nick, because I've got my yoga session. My back hasn't been too good at the moment, so this has actually been. I'm glad I've been not too much in pain. But yeah, it just remains for me to say thank you very much for offering your time. It's been really nice. Yeah, it's been lovely listening to you. And to those at home, you've been watching Nick Clayton, and this is the Nothing to Gain podcast. We're going to wrap it up now. You can find us on YouTube, and there are lots of other interesting guests talking about their lives. And feel free to send me your feedback and your comments. I'm always really interested to hear. So yeah, Nick, until next time, maybe we can do this again sometime.
Happy to, really enjoyed it.
Okay, great stuff.
Cheers.
All right, have a good day.
You too, bye.
Bye now.